just when we thought the morning was absolutely amazing and we learned so much about what the state is doing, the afternoon gets even better. We have with us Dr. Mary Dahlgren, who has over 25 years of experience teaching children and training teachers dealing with all aspects of reading curriculum and instruction. She's worked as a classroom teacher, reading specialist, professional development provider, and consultant to numerous school districts and state departments of education in more than 30 states. She's been a letters trainer for 14 years. She's the former executive director of Payne Educational Center, Teacher Training Center in Oklahoma. She's established teacher trainer for dyslexic students and the support of parents of dyslexic children. In 2015, she served as the committee to review standard setting for the examination of knowledge and practice standards developed by the International Dyslexia Association. Without further ado, I'm not going to go through all the hundreds of schools and funding and everything else that she has provided. There is no question that we will learn a lot this afternoon from her. So, Dr. Mary Dahlgren, thank you so much for being with us today.
Well, thank you. Thank you for that nice introduction and for inviting me to be with you today. And I feel so honored to get to be a contributor to all the work that you're doing. And I'm hoping that some of these things that I bring to you, of course, as you said, I've been a national letters trainer for, I think it's almost 16 years now, actually. And when I was looking back at my notes, saw lots of knowledge from letters, and you'll see that in my talk. And I'm also now, Mary, we were just talking about how busy you are, even though you're retired. I'm now the president of the Oklahoma chapter of the Reading League, and so you'll see a little bit of influence from the Reading League and the work that they're doing as I talk today. And one other source that you'll see a lot of that has had a lot of influence on this talk is Dr. Mark Seidenberg's work. So that will all come up, but here I am talking about embracing the science behind reading and addressing the needs of all learners, including struggling learners. So our objectives of the day are to understand the theoretical models. So I'll talk you through those three theoretical models to start off with, and then we'll talk about understanding reading and writing depends on language abilities, and I don't think that that's something that's clearly understood for many of us. And then we'll consider recommendations for shifts in course syllabi based on the science of reading. And as I said, because we can't leave the development of new teachers to chance. So as I start, I was thinking about, what's all the buzz about? Where did this all, the science of reading has really come to the forefront, and some of the resources that have been in the news recently have elevated that discussion around the science of reading. And Education Week published a commentary back in March of 2019 when some of this work started to emerge. And then, of course, Emily Hanford's work as an investigative reporter really has brought more and more information to the forefront and broken open this whole look at how are we teaching reading and what do we know about how we learn to read. And I think that that's one of there's the science of reading, and then how do we learn are things that I think will be further discussions as we continue our work together. And I say together as we all continue this work. So one of the quotes that I pulled out is, as we're thinking about the science, there's intense public interest in questions surrounding how children learn to read and how they can best be taught. Research in psychological science has provided answers to many of these questions, but somewhat surprisingly, this research has been slow to make inroads into educational policy and practice. So why is that? And what can we do to move this into our educational practice? And we know that's where our biggest gap exists, is how do we get from practice to the classroom? I'll talk about that a little bit today. As I said, Mark Seidenberg is one of the researchers whose work I'm really drawing upon. And the question of how do children learn to read? Do we know? Yes, we can say with confidence, we know more and more about how reading occurs, what has to happen in the brain in order for reading to occur. And so we'll look at some of those elements as we go through the theoretical models. But as he says, the answer is the same for all children. And I think that that's important. We don't have lots of different ways that we learn to read, but cultural, economic, and educational circumstances obviously affect children's progress, but what they need to learn does not change. And as I was thinking about that and rereading his book and his most recent article, which is called Lost in Translation, I highly recommend it if you haven't read it yet. But he brings up the question, why do we persistently have low literacy scores? Why do states continue to write legislation to try to remedy these low outcomes? And why do we disagree about the science? And I say that, why do we disagree about the science? Not that you all are disagreeing with me, but we have lots of pushback in many different places when we talk about the science of reading and thinking about the frameworks that we use in order to prepare our teachers, and even the greater understanding that our teachers need good frameworks around the science of reading in order to plan their own instruction, to plan assessments, and to plan interventions. So one of my first questions for you all is to ask you to think about, just for a minute, frameworks. When you think of reading development, what frameworks guide your thinking? And does a framework help organize the component skills of reading? Or could it when describing reading development and reading difficulties? So I'll just give you a minute to think about, what theoretical frameworks do you use when preparing teachers to teach reading? I'll share the ones that we're commonly using in the science of reading now. But the reason we need a framework, I'm going to show you the slides here of reading is really complicated. And this is a slide from Frank Valentino and colleagues as they analyze the process of reading and what feeds into that. But one, we know this is a complex task, reading, but the outcomes here on the far right side of this slide are context-free word identification, so the decoding side of the equation, and then that bottom part there, language comprehension, with the outcome being, of course, reading comprehension. And I say all of that, and I put this slide in to show the complexity of reading, but we also use what is referred to as the simple view of reading, and Goff and Tumner's graphic that is used consistently throughout talks that I'm attending around the science of reading and understanding. One, they've taken it to a simple view, but we know that reading is extremely complex. So that's why I wanted you to see the Valentino slide before I put up that simple view of reading slide, because there's nothing simple about it. But as I'm helping teachers and understanding what's the process in learning to read, what's necessary to get to reading comprehension, because we're constantly looking for that outcome, but what's going to feed into that outcome, decoding and language comprehension are two big domains that we need to understand, and we need to be able to teach deeply in order for our students to have good reading outcomes, good reading comprehension. And I'm sure you all have seen this before. I think the one thing that I have to emphasize about the simple view of reading is that they were very intentional about using that multiplication sign, because they assigned, if we assign numbers to decoding and language comprehension, we know if you have 0 on either side of the equation, your outcome is going to be 0. But also we could take it further into, I have a student who has some decoding skills, that very beginning reader, and some knowledge. So if we have 0.5 and 0.5, my outcome is going to be 0.25. And so very intentional about the multiplication sign in the simple view of reading as opposed to an addition sign. And because we have to have both of these domains to get to that outcome of reading comprehension. It's not an addition. It's the requirement of both domains. And I'm going to go to Scarborough's reading rope to even go more deeply into each of these domains. And I have to say, when looking at Scarborough's reading rope, it appeared that Hollis Scarborough created this rope based on the simple view of reading, because we have the same domains that she's talking about, language comprehension and decoding. But recently I heard her talk about the rope, and she really did not intentionally base this around the simple view, but the overlap of the models is so nice that we continue to see those. We're validating what's happening in the reading process. And I really like introducing that simple view to teachers and then expanding with the reading rope. And so you see in the reading rope, there's 8 strands, the top 5 strands, language comprehension. And what's involved in language comprehension, we have the background knowledge that's necessary for us to be proficient readers, and that's going to feed into that. The other thing that I have to say about this model that I found fascinating is that Scarborough really made a point to say that the rope model is developmental. So as a developmental psychologist, that's what she was thinking as she created this image, and that it's dynamic. It's not a static model. And I think that that's important, as because we know reading changes over time. And I actually have added that to the bottom of this, the bottom layer of this rope. But what goes into those 5 strands of language comprehension? I need background knowledge, I need strong background knowledge around the topic that I'm reading about, and then I'm probably going to write about. I need my vocabulary knowledge. It grows because I have background knowledge. So those 2 strands are intertwined tightly. Then we have language structures, the syntax of our language, the way words work together, and really understanding in phrasing and the meaning behind sentences. If I don't understand how words are grouped together, that's going to cause a breakdown in my comprehension overall. She also has labeled one of the strands as verbal reasoning, that ability to read between the lines, to make inferences, I have enough knowledge from my verbal reasoning, and again, this is where my background knowledge, vocabulary, language structures come into play. When good writers are referencing events beyond the topic they're writing about, I have to be able to activate and make connections to the content that the writer's writing about, because they can't fill in every piece of information in their writing. So my verbal reasoning requires me to make those inferences and connections. And then the last strand we call literacy knowledge, that importance of understanding when I'm reading the text and when I'm looking at a text, what's the difference in the lens in which I approach a text? Is it a narrative text? Is it an expository text? Is it an opinion piece? How do I really start thinking about those things? And we have this arrow that says increasingly strategic, which is, I think we've really emphasized comprehension strategies throughout our coursework. but I have to add, it's not just about strategy, our, our, our outcome of comprehension, but it's really about the more that I read, the more background knowledge I have, the better my comprehension is going to be. So it's strategies plus. And then another layer of the rope, the next domain, based on the simple view of reading too, word recognition. So those bottom three strands, we have the phonological awareness strand, decoding, and sight word recognition. And again, developing that automaticity is our goal. I continually remind teachers when we talk about word recognition that those top two strands have to be developed. I need to be phonemically aware. I need to understand at least the alphabetic code, how speech maps to print, before I even start to develop that sight word recognition. And I think that that's a really important piece that oftentimes we jump right into sight word recognition and doing instruction with flashcards and sending home things on sight words on little rings for children to read without understanding, or now we have a clear understanding that, boy, if my students don't know, if they're not phonemically aware, at least at the level to blend and segment and beginning reading, and if they don't know all their letter names and they can't easily blend sounds together, the likelihood of them developing a large sight word vocabulary is very limited. So that's an important understanding in the rope, the bottom strands of the rope. I will also say one of the things that Scarborough said in her talk was that you cannot impose the language comprehension strands on top of the word recognition strands. It was very intentional to create these as two separate domains in order for us to think about what's my framework for that developing reader? What do I need in order to educate my students so that they become that skilled, fluent reader that can pay attention to the text itself? So I've added to this slide on the left-hand side, it's a little bit hard to see because of the colorful nature of these things, but the decoding side and the language comprehension, those together, we get our reading comprehension. But I've also added the bidirectional arrow at the bottom of this slide, and the thought that the statement, the relative influence of these components changes over time. So as I become proficient and automatic at word recognition, I don't need to keep teaching those skills to my students. And the other insight into this is that that's a mastery construct, that word recognition. I continue, once I've learned it, I don't have to learn it again. Once I learn to read words, I don't forget words. It's so much more than a visual process. And I think I'll come back to that idea also. But once I learn to read, I have that automatic reading ability, but I still have those language comprehension strands. And in that domain, that's that growth construct. And I consider all of us lifelong learners. And as a teacher, you need to be a lifelong learner. The idea that my background knowledge continues to grow. I'm learning new vocabulary all the time. And those pieces are not something that are stagnant, but they're continuing to become proficient. And so as we say, the relative influence of the components changes over time. As a well-informed teacher, I need to know which components my students need for my instruction. And the big question is, what is it that makes a proficient reader? And what distinguishes a proficient reader to versus that struggling reader? And so a couple of things. One, you can identify and manipulate speech sounds and words at the phoneme level. Really getting to that phoneme level is important. Two, the ability to recognize a new printed word with very few exposures, 1 to 4 exposures. So that's really an interesting piece to think about. the ability to link sound with symbol accurately. And then as I become even more proficient, the ability to process larger chunks of text, which is it reading by syllable? Is it reading by morphemes, reading entire phrases? I have that ability to process those chunks of text as I'm reading, then by paragraph. Moving from very basic to very advanced of when it comes to reading proficiency. And then the ability to recognize words with fluency and automaticity. What does it take to get to that point? That's what a proficient reader does. And so I thought, as I was preparing this and looking at these elements of the proficient reader and thinking about, especially what does it take that I just have to see a word 1 to 4 times in order to store it automatically. Well, there's lots of information that needs to be in place before I do that. That's typically at late first grade, entering second grade level. Typically, if I've had good reading instruction, I move to that ability to recognize and read words that I've never seen before. And I have to say, I was talking with a group of first grade teachers yesterday afternoon, and we were talking about that light bulb moment, that excitement when all of a sudden kids say to you, "Oh my gosh, I didn't have to have you help me read that word. I read that all by myself." And that's the term that we've put on that now is called orthographic mapping, that ability to recognize words without having to sound them out. That's when we get to that proficient reading level. And I understand those underlying skills that go along with that, that must be in place in order for me to get to that ability of orthographic mapping. So I decided I would pose a question for you all to think about, one of several that I've put in this presentation. But do your teacher candidates leave your program with the ability to answer this question? How can we remember and recognize words after 1 or 2 exposures? Do I know the answer to that question? Do I have any idea of what that looks, how I would explain that to a parent, or how I would plan instruction? Because that would be my goal, that my students can read the words that are in front of them, and then I'm freeing up my cognitive desk space so I can continue to think about what it is that I'm reading. I don't have to attend to decoding the words anymore. And so I also have to say, when I use that term, when I say recognize, how can we remember and recognize words? I also take into consideration that I'm activating meaning that goes with that. And this next model that I'm going to show you is the 4-part processing model. This is something that we use in letters all the time. So Language Essentials for Teachers of Reading and Spelling. We base this on some of Seidenberg and McClellan's work. And I have to say, Marilyn Adams also developed this model in her Beginning to Read, Thinking and Learning About Print, and has wrote several papers on this. But the idea of word recognition, I think of the bottom 3 circles here, the phonological, the orthographic, and the meaning. I think of those as the trifecta. As a proficient reader, and you see those green arrows going back and forth between the blue circles, as a proficient reader, all those things are being activated in my brain when I'm reading words. But I have to be able to phonologically access information. So I'm going to talk about language. How does language play a role in reading? I know the sounds, the language. I know the print, the orthography, the print that represents the language, and I have word meaning stored. The context processor in this case is there to help me make sure that I've activated the correct meaning. But we intentionally use this model because context is not integrated with that phonological and orthographic processing. And I say that because we oftentimes see another model that's referred to as MSV, or the 3 cueing system, that actually has all these circles overlapping, when we know that there are different areas, these exist in different areas of the brain. So it's that I'm going to show you some of the research around what happens in the brain and what do we know with confidence about the brain. And we'll look at a couple of images here, but we know, so thinking about the simple view, the expanded simple view, the reading rope, and the 4-part processors, all of those components, we have to have the multi-component approaches. Those work best. We know integrating all of this information in a well-designed program is important. As I said yesterday, I met with some teachers who were just learning about these models, and they said, okay, we're learning about these models, but we don't understand what this has to do with our instruction. And I really appreciated the transparency in their questions, so that I could help them to make more sense of, why do we need these frameworks? And I suggested to them, let's use these models, and let's take your program. And this district is using a program called CKLA, and let's map the elements of your program to the simple view of reading, or to the reading rope. Are we addressing all those things? Now let's talk about, so we can bring it down to actual practice. Now let's talk about assessments. Do you have assessments? Assessing those bottom 3 strands is relatively easy. We have those assessments that are quick and available to us. The top 5 strands of the reading rope, that's a much grayer area, and trying to figure out, how do we know if language comprehension is in place? But a well-designed program is going to teach all of those components, and component emphasis should vary according to student characteristics. So as we're thinking about that struggling reader, I might have to emphasize specific areas in an intervention group or small group with a group of students based on what their needs are. And I need to be able to identify those pieces. And again, that's why a framework is so important. Content, instructional design, methodology, intensity of instruction, all matters in the outcome and in the outcomes for our students. So we know that through the research, I need those frameworks to be able to make good instructional decisions, and I need to have my this research translated into my practice also. So let me move in that direction and think about the science of reading. And as we said, multi-component instruction is necessary, but really when we talk about the science of reading and where has it all come from, it's been a multidisciplinary approach of learning about the brain. So you see my image of the brain here. But cognitive psychologists, neuroscience, linguistics, education, all of those pieces coming together in order to understand how we learn to read, and the necessity of being multidisciplinary in our approach and learning what are the best practices for our students, and how can we take that down to the reality of, okay, if this is what's happening in my brain, what does that mean for my instruction? So again, I go to Seidenberg and some of the implications from thinking about those multidisciplinary studies. And as he says, those cross-disciplinary collaboration should be pursued. So that's one of my charges I'm thinking of. It's not enough to summarize findings. We need teams across these different areas of neuroscience and cognitive psychology to come together and to to help us understand what is it that that is the most effective and efficient way for teaching our students to read. And as the third bullet point says, such teams are likely to be successful or employing basic insights about reading and learning in ways that can be utilized by educators in the classroom. So, but it's not just one area, it's the multidisciplinary area that's necessary for our students for our teachers to have the best information to go back and take that and translate that into practice. So that's a lot that I've said all in a quick 30 minutes there. But I want to take you to the brain imaging studies now, and I want you to think about those theoretical models that I just talked about, and with those theoretical models in mind, looking at real images. And we've had lots of significant advances in understanding the process of reading, and we've come from MRIs that have come from the functional MRI studies, and understanding what happens in those brain imaging studies. So you see an image of this child going into the functional MRI machine, and that he will be asked to read something. So we can see the increased neural activity that causes more oxygenated blood flow. So when I show you a picture of a brain in a few minutes, you'll see areas that are darker. We've highlighted them so that you can see them more clearly. But the iron in the blood produces a strong magnetic signal. Sorry. So the idea that we can actually see where is the blood flow, what areas of the brain are being activated in good readers, and what areas of the brain are being activated in poor readers. We have to know what good readers look like so we can figure out what poor readers, where the breakdown might be occurring for poor readers. And so here's what we know. Reading occurs on the left side of the brain. There's no question about that. And I just had this image up a few minutes ago. This is an image from Stanislas Dehaene, and really beginning to notice and what we know about that blood flow and those images in the brain when they do that functional imaging, that we have the phonological processing that happens at the front of the brain. And I can't help but use my fingers and my head to talk about this, but I getting teachers to think about what's happening. The phonological processing is up here. The sight, when I see print, it's coming in back here in that occipital lobe, and then there's this area right around here. This is not precise, but the idea that that's where the print and the speech map together. So when I'm reading, of course, my sight is activated first, so that orthographic processing, recognizing those images, and then I'm able to match them if I have those sounds stored in my phonological processing. But here's the important part. When I'm building these neural networks, and the gray matter is becoming, it's activated, and these networks are becoming stronger and stronger as I learn to read. And that's where we develop this, that phonological assembly. These pieces begin to come together, and I'm developing and storing more and more words in the visual word form area. So that's the label that Stanislas Dehaene has put on that area in our brain. And that's that moment when I move from sounding out words to when I'm starting to store a large number of words in my visual word form area, 1 to 4 exposures, and those words are in there. And I think the amazing thing about reading is that, again, once those neural networks are built, I don't forget how to read. I don't forget a word once it's been stored in that visual word form area. That's a different thing that then happens when I see people's faces, but I can't think of their names. And that's on the right side of my brain, looking at that facial recognition. And we oftentimes have that failure to recall something, recall a name, recall a location, but that's not on the left side of the brain. And I think that I'm saying that and you know, spending a minute or two talking about this point, the idea that reading is not just a visual process. And once you learn how to decode and how reading, and I have that phonological processing, that orthographic processing, that phonological assembly has occurred there, that phoneme grapheme association, I don't have to keep learning that. And we know that good readers, after they've moved to storing words in that visual word form area, I'm not activating that front of my brain as much as I was as a beginning reader. So again, I think about what Hollis Scarborough said about her rope. It's developmental, it's not static. And I'm building these neural networks. Once I've built those networks, unless there's a brain injury, once I learn how to read, I don't have to keep learning how to read. And so I say that with this thought in mind about the brain imaging studies that have been done. And I even have on this slide reading on the wrong side of the brain. So what happens when I'm a struggling reader and we notice that our struggling readers there's very little activation in the left hemisphere. And so why is that? What's happening with some of our students in our classrooms? Well, oftentimes they've been told to look at the picture. What makes sense? What word would fit there? Look at the first letter and what would make sense now? So we're actually teaching them to use the right side of their brain as opposed to developing that what's happening, and we know in proficient readers' brain and the left side of the brain. We have to make sure that we're not introducing strategies that are not effective. We have to think about what areas of the brain are being taught, need to be taught in order to develop that automaticity and fluency so I can be that proficient reader. I can get to that outcome of reading comprehension. So as I was thinking about those pieces and what's happening in the science of reading, I also wanted to bring up, what are some of the obstacles that happen? So we have our obstacles to the science of reading, the science versus the practice, as you see on the slide here, and some of the things that we see. Many of our college professors have been unfamiliar with it, the science of reading, or opposed to it, and literacy textbook publishers often do not include it or address it correctly. So that's oftentimes left out of our college textbooks. In instances where teacher candidates are taught about evidence-based practice, the exposure is brief. 2 classes in undergrad, 2 classes in graduate school, and most administration programs don't include anything about the science of reading at all. So it takes more than 2 classes to learn this information. Federal policy initiatives that included it have been rolled out in mass and oftentimes too quickly without the adequate support and understanding for teachers to put things in place. There's been a lot of money, budgetary issues that lots of money put into the science of reading or rolling out big initiatives. But again, we're oftentimes missing the understandings, the underpinnings of what needs to happen in order for our students to be successful readers. Other obstacles that occur. We have educators, including reading specialists, are unaware of the science of reading. Scientists have not contributed to a pipeline of knowledge, and schools may not embrace it. I can't tell you how many sessions I've done, I've presented when teaching across the United States, and teachers say to me, I've got my master's, and how come I didn't know this information? I can't believe I didn't know this. And so why, why do we continue to have low test scores or outcomes? It's things that are these obstacles that continue to be problematic. Educators perceive the practices they are implementing as effective, but the gap doesn't close. Our publishers of curriculum and instructional materials often don't include the science of reading and what we've learned. Again, I say the science of reading, the components that are necessary to get my students to from beginning reading to being proficient readers. And then as practitioners, most educators don't have access to university libraries, and or they have little time or incentive, and the materials they do have access to oftentimes don't include it. And that's something I'm seeing more papers shared, more information that's getting out there thanks to social media about what is the latest research. But we have to be careful about fads versus what's the research, and what does this mean for practice and application in our classrooms. Other things that happen, the amount of information that's out there, it's overwhelming. I continue to hear teachers that the fear of missing out, like there's so many different things that are coming at me, how do I know what to pay attention to? The importance of having well-designed classes, understanding the words, concepts, and background of the terminology that we're working with. And as we said, oftentimes these articles by our researchers, the cognitive science and the neuroscientists, are not translatable to practice. So that's again where those teams that need to come together in order to help us bring it down to what's this look like in my classroom. Oftentimes we encounter this overarching cynicism and rejection of science, a lack of understanding of the scientific method and its value of the practice. Oftentimes it seems complex and threatening, but we know that we need large-scale studies with broad demographics in order to inform us about what works with a variety of children. So making sure that we are considering the research that we're using and we're sharing with others, it really has that it has that broad context of, can it be replicated? Did I use, were there a large number of students in the study? And what practices, are the practices something that can be translated into the classroom? And then do we see, of course, the growth? Then we have, of course, the Peter effect, or in one of the things that I talk about is Gordon's ladder of success. And at the very bottom rung of Gordon's ladder, we don't know what we don't know. And what does it take to be, so I'm unskilled and I'm uninformed versus I become informed, but I'm still unskilled, to I'm consciously skilled, and I'm still learning about all of the knowledge that goes with it, to the point of I become consciously unskilled. I know how to assess and teach my students. When you bring in information and I'm data about a student, or I sit down to work with a student, I can begin making good instructional decisions right away, because I understand what's necessary to support those students, right, regardless of their knowledge base when they come in to work with me. So other things that, well, the other piece that I want to bring back to this is these theoretical models. Again, I started with that question, the framework. What frameworks do you use when you think about the development of reading? And so I've presented these theoretical models, the reading rope. We have the simple view of reading that overlaps on the reading rope, and then the 4-part processors that also overlap with the reading rope and the simple view. But one of the points that I wanted to make here by bringing back these models is the fact that phonics is not the central focus of any of these models. And I wanted to add that in here today because I constantly hear people saying, well, the science of reading, it's all about phonics. It's all about phonics. Well, phonics is a part of that. But as you look at each of these models that I presented to you, phonics is not the central focus of those models. Well integrated instruction means that I'm teaching all elements that are included in these models and knowing what are the necessary elements in order for me to become a proficient reader or for me to plan instruction for my students. So what do we know? What do we need to think about? Implications. We want to work towards that new science of teaching. So we're working on the science of reading, but how do we understand what needs to be learned? The how of learning via teaching, and when learning of a particular kind needs to occur and for whom. Man, those are some big questions. Thinking about what needs to be learned, how do I learn it, when is it important for, when am I ready to move from one level to the next level, and what do I know about my students in order to inform my practice for providing that instruction. So you're going to see on this next slide, I was thinking about what implications for coursework, what needs to happen. So you're going to see a couple of slides that have the numbers at the top. So number 1, foundation concepts about oral and written language learning. So understanding how language and reading are related. Reading exists because of language. Why learning to read is not natural. We learn to speak naturally, but if we learned to read naturally, we wouldn't actually be here discussing this. How the process of reading unfolds over time. What's that development? And then how do good readers differ from poor readers? So those are things, that's my first recommendation, and thinking about what needs to be in course syllabi is those foundational concepts about oral and written language learning. So I thought for a fun way to take this into consideration that I'd have you do a little bit of an activity and thinking about what's it like to read without being able to read all the words on the page. So for your involvement, I would really like for you all to grab a sheet of paper and number it 1 to 20. And I'm going to show you some slides, and some of the words are missing. So I want you to fill in those words. So I'll give you a minute to grab a sheet of paper, number that. As you're numbering that, I'm going to tell you that the slides that are coming up, you're going to have some words that are left out on each of the slides. And the first one you're going to see is going to be if you could read the words with 70% accuracy. So the flip side of that is that I don't know, I can't recognize or read 30% of the words. So I want you to think about that in 2 ways. Either I can't decode the word, or I don't know what the word means, because both of those things are going to obviously impact my comprehension. So here we go. You have about, I don't know if I'm going to give you a full minute. I'm going to give you about 45 seconds to fill in the blanks. Do the best you can. Okay, I'm going to go ahead and stop us there. That's been 30 seconds. I don't know if you got all the way through, if you gave up at this point because it's really not making any sense to you. And I hope you all made some good guesses. Let's see. I'm going to give you some of the words. So you can check the lines and see. Number 1, were you accurate? Did you use the word world? Number 5, did you use the word create? Number 7, did you use the word bushes? 9, planning. 10, clipping. 19, animals. And 20, wood. I'm guessing no. You might have gotten one of those words, but the likelihood is slim. So now, as you're looking at this slide, would you change the words that we still haven't revealed yet? So I'll give you a minute to read through it again and see if you might change some words. And if you are changing words, and if that's what a reader's doing because they're struggling to read, that's pretty demotivating. I'm not feeling excited about reading this again because I don't understand it and because I can't read the words, and I'm doing lots of guessing. Okay, I'm going to advance the slide and tell you that, so we filled in more blanks. So the green words now are the words that have been filled in the blanks, and you might check to see if you knew this was about gardens and gardening, and you're going to see that word used a lot. First 3, the next slots that have been filled. And now the challenge for you is, are you going to change the 5 words that we still haven't filled in yet? Do you think you know what they are? And would you change those now that you can read with 90% accuracy? What do you think is going to be in that first blank? And in the second blank? There's only 5. And when I do this with teachers, I often ask them, by the time we get here, and I show you the answers on the next slide, how many of you got 100% of those right? So here we go. I put them in purple. So in the world of gardens, nothing is impossible. Who knows if you chose that word? So some gardeners create life-size mazes. I'm thinking the likelihood of you getting that one was pretty slim. Further down, it says, a gardener's careful planning and clipping can create strange paths. Others cut and shape plants into awesome, larger than life, and incredible leafy animals. I find when I do this with my teachers that they say they might have gotten 1 or 2 of the words accurately, and that's at 90% accuracy. So what does that do to comprehension? Again, it's not very motivating. I'm not likely to keep reading and trying to figure out what that next word is if I can't decode the words and if I don't understand what they mean. So I use that example to really get that point across of that the fact that only 1 in 10 words on average can be guessed from context. Wow. And then if I can guess the word, guessing is not reading, then if I can guess the word, I'm probably able to guess it because I have background knowledge about that subject. And but if I have weak background knowledge, low language skills, I probably can't even come up with a word. Word recognition depends on fast, accurate phoneme grapheme mapping, so that ability to map the speech to the print. Every step in word reading development requires deep, secure phonologic integration. So that ability, as I said, that phonological, that connection between phoneme grapheme mapping that happens in this area of the brain, that angular, we call it the angular gyrus, that's so necessary in order for us to become that proficient reader. And I use this quote, I just love this quote, that there's no comprehension strategy powerful enough to compensate for the inability to read the words. And hopefully that exercise helped make that point, but also knowing that we need students to be accurate, at least 95% accurate. That still means I might not know 2 to 3 of the words. Our true accuracy, reading the words correctly, especially in first and second grade, hitting that 98% accuracy. And then the other thing that I didn't put on this slide is that I need to know the meanings of 95% of the words in order for me to comprehend also. So it's the one side of the equation, that word recognition side, I need about 98% accuracy. I need to be able to read with confidence. So I've moved to that orthographic mapping. I'm storing words in that visual word form area, but I'm also activating that meaning processor. And I have lots of words stored or information stored in my mental lexicon as I'm thinking about that. So all of these important pieces that go into becoming that proficient reader. And I've mentioned that the knowledge of the structure of language, and that reading is based on language. So here's my number 2 recommendation. What do teachers need to know and be able to do? They need to know about the structure of language. So we talk about phonology and phonemes, English orthography, the print, morphology, meaning, meaningful parts of words, the semantics. Again, we're talking about meanings and how words relate to one another, the syntax, the grammar of our language, discourse, longer written pieces that I can follow and comprehend the text as I'm reading. And then of course the pragmatics, the give and take of language, and understanding pragmatics in spoken language, that idea of when you're speaking to me, I can read your face, I can hear your voice, but that voice, and when I'm reading, I need to understand when a character or when the author is being facetious, or maybe something is very serious, but I misunderstand that. Those are things that oftentimes are lost in print, that our students don't ever cue into. As a teacher, I need to know about all the how to address all of these pieces. So this is my mentor, Louisa Moats. This is I really credit the majority of my learning to Louisa. But this is one of her images that I really love. Language is at the center here, and she says reading is parasitic on language. So I need language in order to be a reader. But what is language made up of? And again, this is where I think there's often a breakdown. I think of language, I think of speaking, but we're thinking of all of these different areas that I listed on the previous slide, and then thinking about how all of these contribute to language. The language systems are things that I need to understand how each piece contributes to developing that proficient reader. And here's another possibly big insight for us. When we read, we go from speech to print. So I know the sounds, I know words, but I also have to learn how to sound those out. and we don't go from print to speech. So we're wired to process language unconsciously, that ability to learn to speak. And our children, our very young children, babies, at a year old start, well, even before a year old, but they're starting to babble. They're starting to put words together. 2 years old, they're putting 2 and 3 words together. 3 years old, they're starting to ask questions and putting phrases together. By 4 years old, typically speaking in complete sentences and understanding the syntax of language, understanding morphology of language. And I'm thinking about my pre-K students and kindergarten students. They understand that there's a suffix S on the end of a word in spoken language. They don't know it's called suffix S, but they know that when I want to make a word plural, I add that S. So can I have, I wouldn't say, can I have a nut, but can I have some nuts? And the idea that happens naturally. Reading is not natural. I have to be taught that information, but it's so fascinating the way that we develop that speech, the understanding of syntax, the understanding of morphology. We don't put all those labels on it, but that's what goes into language. So I have to understand all of these elements of language, and thinking about, we move from speech to print. And I say that because oftentimes teachers that I work with, they think about print and then I need to decode that print in order to get it to speech, but I need to know about language first. I need to understand the sounds of my language. So here's one of the big pieces I have to say that's really become commonplace in the science of reading discussions and topics are sound walls. And that, what is a sound wall? The phonology and really the phonetics of our language, understanding that there's 44 speech sounds in the language, and knowing what is it, how are those sounds produced, and how do those sounds vary. And I want you to just look at the vowel valley on the right hand side there. Typically when we think of vowels, we think A, E, I, O, U. There's actually 18 vowel sounds listed here, and there's 18 vowel sounds in our language. And understanding and organization of the sounds is also going to help inform, if I know the sound, what are my choices for spelling that sound? So we're teaching our kindergarten and first grade students in many of our schools, we're teaching them all these all about the sounds of the language. So once I learn the sound, I know the sound as in thumb, but I also learn that TH is representing that sound. I know the sound, I can easily match the print to that sound. So as opposed to going from our students, and if any of you all have ever taught first grade, you know how many of your students would say to he instead of the, because so often we've gone from speech to print. I'm thinking every letter has to represent a sound, but if I know the sounds, now I begin to understand there are certain graphemes, letters that represent those sounds. That's how the English language, going from speech to print. So here's another level of that layer of language. We have the phonology, and a teacher needs to know how the correspondences work. Otherwise, they can't explain them. So again, this is one of Luisa's slides, but we teach phoneme, grapheme, mapping. What are the sounds in the word? And then what are the graphemes that represent those sounds? And we know the English language is not always consistent. And I think that one of the fascinating things on this slide in looking at the phonology and orthography is we have the word tough. So I have and I see O-U-G-H in that word, but the O-U is representing the sound, and the G-H is representing the sound. But then look at the last word. The last word is through, and I've got O-U-G-H there, but I have ooh, and knowing, oh my gosh, O-G-H in this word is just representing one sound, not two different sounds. man, I need to really understand the language and how, one, the sounds in my language, and then what's the print that represents those sounds. That deserves a class all by itself. And learning about that phonology and then mapping the speech to the print, um, so that I can easily explain that to my students. Here's another layer. We have, how do you know a word's meaning? The semantics and the syntax of our language. So when I know a word, I typically store words in networks and relationships to other words. But I know a word because I might know an antonym for that word or a synonym. I don't know a word just because I can give you a dictionary definition. And understanding when I'm teaching vocabulary and teaching my students, these are elements that I can use to plan good vocabulary instruction. And I say that because I use this image a lot in my trainings. And oftentimes my teachers think, oh, I can give this to my students and they can fill that out. That's not the intent here. The intent here is that as I'm introducing vocabulary, I'm thinking about, does this word have an antonym or a synonym? What's the connotation that I need to be teaching so that my students know how to use this word well? I use this as that, or does my word have multiple meanings? All of those different elements. I use this as a planner, but it's not something for my students to fill out. It's something for me to determine, how am I going to teach this work? What are the tools that I have? What makes sense in order to develop that understanding of word learning, and learning about the different layers of words and word knowledge, and also helping students to become metacognitive and to also become learners themselves. I need them to move to the point where they begin learning words on their own without just my direct instruction, because I can't begin to teach all the words that they need to know. So the other part of another recommendation, knowledge of dyslexia and other learning disabilities. That's very important in our education programs, and thinking about how do we match the symptoms of the major subgroups of poor readers as established by research, and I'll address that on the next slide, including those with dyslexia, and identify typical case study profiles of those individuals. So knowing about what are common learning disabilities that my students, I will face in a classroom. And this is knowledge for my general ed classroom teachers and for my special ed teachers, because it's a group effort, and I need to understand, all of our teachers need to understand what are the subtypes and what do I need to do to address those students. It's not just during a pull out or push in that students' needs are being addressed, but throughout the whole day. So this is just a quick overview. We could spend a long time talking about each of these subtypes, but the idea that has been that the recognized subtypes, the most common subtypes of poor readers, those that have the phonological deficits, so phonological processing and that proficiency, that ease in which I can manipulate and work with sounds in the language, fluency, naming speed. Do I have that rapid response? Can I, when I see or when I'm manipulating sounds, can I do it quickly and automatically? When I see a word, can I name it automatically, or patterns? So I'm going to use, when I see TH together, as I see TH, do I know instantly that could say the or the sound? That's that automaticity that we're talking about. And then language comprehension. And we know that we're starting to really look more closely at developmental language differences, but language comprehension is a problem that's I think more difficult for us to pin down, because again, I go back to the upper strands, the reading rope, all of the things that contribute to language comprehension They're harder to identify than that phonological deficit, for sure. And when I have a student that has, so, okay, before I move on, the overlap of these three, that's the most common area where you see the breakdown. It's not just the typical one area that a student has where the student has difficulties. If that's the case, then they probably have a very specific learning disability, but our struggling readers often have the phonological deficit and the naming speed both, or they have both the phonological deficit, naming speed, and language comprehension. And one of our researchers, Keith Stanovich, labeled them the garden variety poor readers, the students who have both poor decoding and poor language comprehension. So those are some of the most common things that we see with our poor readers. Those are the subtypes. So knowing one, where's the breakdown occurring? Typically not just one area. And two, what do I do with those students as I'm providing instruction and planning instruction? So looking at skilled reading on a continuum, thinking about those poor readers, I love this slide. You guys might have seen the ladder of reading. But here on the slide, starting on the far right in the blue, you see that 5% of our students, they learn to read effortlessly. And unfortunately, it's only 5%. 35% of our students learn to read relatively easily with general instruction. And so those students are what we consider our average reader, proficient reader. So we have that good superstar reader, highly proficient, then we have our average readers. So that's about 40% of our students. But then you look at the next level of our students who are below average, basic or not proficient. 40 to 50% of our students learning to read proficiently requires code-based, explicit, systematic, and sequential instruction. Do I know what that is? Do I know in my head a scope and sequence for teaching those struggling readers how to decode the words, so the word recognition side, and how to teach the language comprehension pieces? Then we have the well below average reader, 10 to 15% of our kids, oftentimes dyslexic readers, they fall into this category. So there's my little bouncing dyslexic reader. But that again, we need that explicit, systematic, sequential instruction. I need to be diagnostic. I need to have good assessments in order to target the instruction, and to have progress monitoring to make sure that I'm meeting my students' needs. Is the help helping is the question, and then the number of repetitions that those students need in order to build those neural networks. That's important too. But we say that those far on the left-hand side, all of these students need explicit systematic instruction, 40 to 60% in every classroom. So thinking about what's it going to take to close the gap for a student. And then assessment. I've mentioned assessment many times, but I need to know about assessments. What's a good screener? What should I be screening for, depending upon my students? What do they know? What are they able to do? What level are they? If they are not performing on level based on screenings that have been designed for specific expectations at second grade, third grade, do I have diagnostic tools that are going to help me peel back and figure out where the breakdown is occurring? And then, as I said, progress monitoring. We have that ability to check in to make sure is the work working, and then of course knowing an outcome assessment. The big question of is our program effective? Is our work that we're doing effective overall? What do we need to know about that? So understanding the different types of assessments and being able to select and use assessments well is critical for our teachers going into the classroom. So when I use assessments, I oftentimes use that screening and diagnostic assessment to plan differentiation. And I say that because the next slide is about fallacies about differentiation, things that have been taught, and the idea of differentiating by learning styles, no research to support that. Cueing system preference, we don't have in-depth research about that. Level of reading, we've been pushing reading levels at kids or at teachers. What does it mean if I'm a level G? I don't have any idea what that means. I do have an idea, but I don't know. Do I know? Does my student know all the letters of the alphabet? Can they recognize basic grapheme and phoneme correspondences? Are they learning to store sight words automatically? What's their comprehension like? What's their vocabulary and background knowledge? I need to have specifics. Levels don't help me do that. Interest and motivation, that's important, but that's not how I differentiate. Gender, we know. IQ, no. So these are some fallacies that have been brought into instruction that we need to move away from. And we need to focus on that science and structured literacy. So applications in structured literacy instruction, what's involved? Phonological skills, phonics and word recognition, fluency, vocabulary, comprehension, spelling and writing, and all of those things need to be provided in our programs. And so as I'm thinking about getting to the end of this talk, and what have I listed here as the recommendations, I've really pulled these from the knowledge and practice standards from the International Dyslexia Association. These are not standards based on what's good for the dyslexic child, but what is good for all readers. What do teachers need to know? We need to know about the foundations of literacy acquisition, the knowledge of diverse reading profiles, including dyslexia, not just dyslexia, because there were other profiles that I talked about. We need to know about assessment, structured literacy instruction, and then, of course, the professional dispositions and practices. So a well-designed teacher education program includes the entirety of these standards. And hopefully something to think about as I wrap this up, things that I tell teachers when they've been in classes with me and we've really dug into the science behind learning and reading. 1, empowering teachers, be smarter than your program. Question knowing if there's gaps in your program. So I have my frameworks. Again, I have to keep going back to the simple view and the 4-part processor, but I have those frameworks so I can be smarter than my program. Is my program actually addressing each of these, understanding how language works? So the written system, the phonological system. I showed you that slide that was pretty messy with language at the center of that. And then the assessments used to combine these elements into good daily instruction to be more effective and efficient in practice. My teachers, I know that my teachers are teaching with confidence when they can say, I understand and I know these things. So I have to end with one of my heroes, a man I'd love to meet one day, Stanislaus Dehaene, who says, it's simply not true that there are hundreds of ways to learn to read. When it comes to reading, we all have roughly the same brain that imposes the same constraints and the same learning science. And I think that that's, we say that the science of reading, the reading science that we have, but we also need to continue to work on the science of learning. What does it take in order for those neural networks to be built, and to activate that and to motivate our readers, to cause them to be critical thinkers, all of those pieces. What is that? That's all part of that as we're developing that understanding of what does it take to learning the science behind, or the science behind learning is I think the next forefront for us to take into consideration. So I have come to the end of my talk, and I would love to entertain questions if you would like, but I want to say thank you for making a difference when I was thinking about wrapping this up and really considering who you are and who I'm talking to, that you all are the center of that drop that creates that ripple effect. And you're so important and so key, and I appreciate your time and your efforts, your energy to make a difference, because you are at the center of that ripple. So thank you so much.